Hello, everybody. My name is Claire Weber. I'm the founder of HerDad. I am here today with Sara Chizek of Sara Chizek Coaching. Such an honor to have you today, Sara. Hello.
Thank you. So good to be here with you, Claire, my love.
Well, we have a really interesting and I think fun conversation planned today. Fun is usually not the word associated with the topic we're going to cover, which is grief.
Sure.
And that's something that you and I have connected over. And I met Sara a little over a year ago. And of the many things that we connected about, we share a common experience of early childhood loss of a parent. And so we have shared a lot about our own personal journeys. And for both of us, it informs the work that we have chosen to do in this world about the journey of grief. And so I'll let her talk a little bit about how she does that, and then I'll share how it informs what I do with HerDad. So, Sara, do you want to tell us
Yeah.
about your business and how your grief journey has informed what you've chosen to do?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I so honor the connection that we have, Claire. It's super special and sacred to me. So I am a grief and sensuality coach, and it was not always this way. Just 3 years ago, I was in a real stuck place. My dad had died when I was 4 years old, and I really felt stuck in my emotional range. I had a lot of unattended grief that I hadn't taken a look at and I was avoiding. And then I decided to actually take a look at all of that pain. And it was in that process that I really came home to myself, that I came home to my body, to like the divine range of emotions that we have access to as human beings. And that I really cultivated a lot of acceptance for this grief. And so through this process, which I'll share a little bit more a little later, I really came into my power. And it was in that moment of coming to like connection with my dad's death that I was like, oh, this is what I'm meant to do here on this planet. And so fast forward 3 years and I have quit my corporate job, and I am a full on one-on-one coach. I also host workshops where women can really tend to their grief, to their anger, to any of the emotions that society often shames or tells us are too much and we should shove under the rug. Really calling in to kind of the greatness and like the full scale of what our emotional range can be. So yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I definitely want to talk more about blending these two words of grief and sensuality. It's not something we hear often. So we'll dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'll introduce where this fits in for my work with HerDad. So I work with dads who have daughters, whether they're young or adult daughters. And I have a very specific focus and a big heart for dads who have been widowed and have daughters who, the term for is motherless daughters. And that's because I was a motherless daughter. My mom died right around her 30th birthday when I was about 3. And so my dad was left overnight as a solo dad, a widowed dad with his own, grief, and left to raise 3 tiny children. And so, my journey started really young with grief. I often say I don't remember a time before grief was my kind of constant companion because I was so little. And
Mm.
so the journey of healing from that has been profound. And it, as much like you talked about, Sara, it has unlocked things within me that eventually have led to my vocational life, and knowing that this is what I'm meant to do in the world. And HerDad was actually inspired by talking to a widowed father raising a daughter and realizing that, oh my gosh, like
Mm.
there's nothing out there for this man, just like there was nothing out there to help my dad. How could he have known how to raise a small daughter? So this work is entirely inspired by that journey, my personal journey, and then realizing that there's something to be shared with the world about this, and there's a deep need to. So,
Mhm.
I work with all dads and all daughter situations, but a very, very specific expertise and focus on men who are on the grief journey themselves and who are, accompanying their daughters. And, one thing that you mentioned and that we share is that we both had this unattended grief as children. And
Mhm.
so I wanted to say a quick word about that and how important it is for people in general to attend to their own grief, but especially if there are children who are grieving. One of the things I
Mhm.
talk to widowed fathers about is how important it is to understand and learn what the impact is of early childhood loss. And one of the things that I've learned a lot about that from is through the work of Hope Edelman. So I would love to hear if there have been specific teachers that have helped you on this process or how you've come to learn about this. Hope Edelman has been a profound teacher and she's got a great new book out. It's amazing. It's called The After Grief. And it
Mhm.
talks about the impacts later in life about early childhood loss. And there's so little written about this. And
Mhm.
she's been just an incredible teacher. She also wrote a book called Motherless Daughters. So it's all about understanding the journey of a daughter who loses her mom really early. So I just want to put a plug in for that because her work is just incredible, and it has been one of the biggest influences on the way that I have understood my own journey and the way that I now work with other people. So what about you? In addition to your personal
Yeah.
experience, which is probably the biggest teacher, what else
Right.
has informed the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think one piece, and kind of like I said, the grief, I think that we had a little bit of different experiences because like my grief wasn't a part of me until probably like 20, 27, 28. And it was at that point that um I made the decision to bring it into my life and that I could hold it and dance with it and move with it. And when I made that decision, I also decided to volunteer for an organization that provides grief coaching groups for children who have just lost a parent. And so that experience in itself was so beneficial in my understanding because while I was in those grief sessions supporting those little kiddos who were like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, there was like my inner child sitting in that room too, who was also absorbing the work that we were doing and just really coming to understand like how catastrophic it is for a young person to lose a parent. Even the my understanding of like my attachment styles through that book Attached, of being both like anxious and avoidant because of the loss, like was a really really kind of eye-opening experience. And I would also say the work that Claire and I do together with Regina Thomashower of just like embracing the grief and radically accepting the grief, like radically accepting any feeling that you're having. So, like, just the practice of like, I am sad today, and my sadness is perfect exactly where it is. Like, things like that, which felt like foreign land to me before I started to bring the into the fold. And one piece, which is more personal, was that my mom actually wrote journals to me growing up. And so she wrote a journal to me like every year of my life. And when she began that incredible process, she didn't know that that her husband, my father, was going to die at the age of 4. And she gifted me all these journals. And the fourth journal I avoided reading my entire life because I was terrified of what was going to be in those pages recounting the day of his loss. But I finally, when I came around to the point of like, I need to know what's in those journals, like my healing is in those pages. It was really within those pages that I, I let myself sob and grieve. And then I brought in my own sensual power and my own pleasure and turn on into the kind of elixir of and kind of potion of the process that I now teach. But there was a huge personal learning in those pages as well of like, what I can hold and how I can hold myself through the process of grieving.
That's so beautiful. My gosh, every time you talk about those journals, it just gets so
Mhm.
overwhelmed. How beautiful. What a gift. And your courage to finally
Mhm.
crack open number 4.
Yes.
And it's so unique the way that you work with grief. This idea of bringing bringing pleasure into grief. Like we never hear that, and that's something that you and I share. This concept that the grief journey can be one that is filled with richness, um,
Yeah.
with gifts. I think that grief is traditionally talked about as something like at best that we survive and start to manage around. And I know
Mhm.
that was my experience for a long time,
Mhm.
for you, it didn't kind of appear until later in life. For me, it was constantly present, but it wasn't anything that I knew how to engage with in any healthy way. So it it wasn't a good kind of companionship
Mhm.
until I did make a conscious choice. I think much like you, where I chose to finally like, okay, let's get in here and deal with it. And that took me on a long
Mhm.
journey. And
Mhm.
so this idea that you and I have both experienced in our lives, and I think what we're so passionate about sharing with people is um, that grief can bring us like a whole other level of being that wouldn't otherwise be available to us. And I've come to see my own grief journey as like one of the greatest gifts of my life because of the way I've chosen to embrace it and work with it and move with it and all of these things, much the way you described. And so something that I know that I feel really strongly about when I work with people in the grieving process and really exploring this concept is like, this doesn't have to be something that we're terrified of. This can be one of the greatest teachers of our lives. And yes, there's a process where it's just devastation, of course. There's a process where it's just nothing but heartache and pain. But if we're willing to ride that out and then to embrace it in a way with skillful companions, there's a
Yeah.
way that this can become a source of incredible richness. And referring back to Hope Edelman, that's some of the stuff I've learned from her too, and the way that she talks about the long arc of grief. That there's these misguided notions of, one of the original models of grief, that there's some stages and stuff like that. That has long since been sort of debunked. There is a
Mhm.
whole new modern theory about grief that is much more in line with the things that you and I are talking about, that it's a long arc, that it's not any kind of stages, that it's something that we can embrace and thrive because of, instead of survive in spite of. And I think that's what's so great about the way that you and I are both engaging with this and what we want to share with people. So is there anything else you would want to say about that?
Well, I just think it's incredible how our wounds always find a way. Like we are literally giving. I really, you inspire me because you're giving your biggest, potentially biggest life wound a microphone, and the impact that that's going to have on a little girl who has become motherless, and now her father is able to she's able to heal through him being like a rock for her and show up. I just think it's really, really incredible. And I come from actually a fractured family where my mom remarried, and her new husband had also been widowed with a daughter. So he was a single dad for years and years. And I remember the stories of like mac and cheese, Kraft mac and cheese for dinner, like every night. And, not knowing what to do with the hair. There was just like a tenderness to like him doing the best that he could. And my now sister also like craving that piece of motherhood. So I'm the work that you're doing just it if I had had access to it, if my family had access to that, I think that there would have been a lot of earlier stages of healing for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, in the work that you're doing, so to talk about your work, and gosh, you inspire me in so many ways on my continued journey, because I've come to accept it never ends. I spent so much of my life thinking I had to get over my mom. And then I
Mhm.
discovered Hope Edelman's worth, and she's like, there's nothing to get over here. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so with your work, on my continuing evolving journey and my dynamic relationship to my grief process and to my mom, I've had the pleasure of working with you some, and it's
Yeah.
such a different way of embracing and like not just accepting, but honoring the
Yeah.
grief process. And one of my favorite things is the way that you work with the body, because the grief is
Hmm.
so kept in our body. Is there anything you want to say about that and why you choose to work that way?
Yeah, another amazing book is The Body Keeps the Score,
Mhm.
which like really highlights the fact that grief lives in the body. All of our emotions live really deeply in our body. And so I think what wasn't clicking for me before I went on this journey was that um a lot of like the talk therapy that I went to was like all in like the outer layers of the brain, right? Like the prefrontal cortex, cortical pieces of our brain. And it wasn't until I moved with the grief physically and danced with the grief physically is that the deeper parts of my brain came online into the space of feeling and of healing. And so a lot of the work that I lead women through in my programs is to music, where we're literally moving our body the way that your grief wants you to move. So like giving your grief the driver's seat and the wheel, and allowing the grief to move however it wants, the rage, the anger, like the crankiness, frustration. And we do that to music over the arc of quite a few different pieces of music. And then there's this piece where like we've kicked up all this raw emotion, right? Like all the grief, all the rage, all the anger is now flowing through the body. And there's this opportunity to fully harness it and take ownership over all of those emotions. And we do that by bringing pleasure into the process, which when I first heard this process from Mama Gina, I was like, are you sure about that? Like, you want me to turn what on now? But then I actually tried like just like a slow hip circle in the depth of my tears, or putting my hands on my body and feeling my hips, feeling my body. And when you can come into contact with your divine life force power that is your feminine energy in the mix of all of these quote unquote like darker emotions, then it becomes this renewable energy and it becomes fuel for this life force energy within you. And so fuel for pleasure, fuel for your passions, fuel for whatever it is that turns you on in life. And that's where this like transmuting of energy, transmuting of grief into a superpower comes in, which is what I do day in and day out with my clients and in the workshops that I lead.
It's so cool. It's so radical. And I think, such
Yeah.
a beautiful way to talk about grief as fuel. And it's something that
Hmm.
if you can actually tap into and learn to access, it can be just a tremendous source of power. And if you don't, it can be a tremendous source of depletion. And just,
Yes.
I always say that, that grief that we don't deal with just gets held in escrow. It's just,
Yeah.
compounding interest every day
Hmm.
until we access it. It just grows and grows and grows. It doesn't go anyway. It doesn't go
Yeah.
away. So
Yes.
I love the way that you do this.
Mhm.
Let's talk briefly about who we work with and how they can find us if they want to learn more. So you work exclusively with women, is that correct?
Yes, I work with women who feel disconnected from their pleasure, who feel like that sense of depletion from their grief, who feel stuck, and unable to move forward in areas of their life, like maybe not even knowing what it is that they desire and how they want to shape like the rest of their journey. And so we work through and with the grief, with all of the emotions that come up. And then over kind of the arc of typically what is an 8-week journey, we bring turn on into the picture. And in that, we bring in passion and what drives us and what makes us feel alive. And then after we've kind of chucked up all of those like raw emotions, there's access to actually flex your desire muscle. And so to move in the direction of what it is that you desire, which often isn't even like fathomable or available to us when we're stuck under a rock of grief. So it's really this arc of honoring the grief, honoring what is, bringing acceptance and love into exactly how you're showing up in your grief, and then moving towards pleasure, towards sensual radiance, towards love.
That's beautiful. And
Yeah.
so you work with women who may identify that they're stuck in their grief, but I imagine that there are women, maybe like you and I were at certain parts in our lives, especially as younger women, where we didn't actually know. Like I did not know how profound an early loss was impacting me because I couldn't make that direct association. So I imagine that it's probably for women who maybe are all just kind of stuck in general,
Yes.
that there's probably some grief, and it may not be an early
Yeah,
parent loss. It may not be an early loss at
exactly.
all. It could be a divorce. It could be the loss of a
Yeah.
relationship, the loss of a child, maybe some
Job.
ambiguous loss, right? So
Yeah.
it can
The
look a lot
loss
of
of a
different ways.
job, the loss of like any sort of life transition that we go through as women, even like the collective grief that is very
Mhm.
prevalent in the world right now, just processing all of that. It manifests similarly no matter what it is that you're grieving. So
Yeah,
yeah.
right. Wonderful. So I work with men who are dads of daughters, and the way that I work is one-on-one. And I am not a specific grief coach. So my goal is not focused on the grief journey of the dad specifically. However, I am very, I guess, grief informed and
Yeah.
understand how to respect the grieving process and help accompany men through that. And most importantly, to help them be better able to accompany their daughter in the case of a loss of the mother. And
Mhm.
that's the most important area of focus that I have. So I generally work with men about probably 1 to 2 years post loss. That early
Mhm.
time is really, really acute. And I think that's when really specific grief specialists are best served. Although I can help inform, like remember to keep your wife's clothes, and help the dad know what to do in the midst of a loss like that, because there are
Yeah.
some really, really important things that dads can do really early post loss to help the daughter on the longer arc of things. So I do work kind of consulting in that way at that time. But it really is about, being sensitive to what the father himself may be going through, helping him to understand the daughter's journey, because the number one predictor of the long term quality of life of a daughter who has lost her mother is the care she receives from the primary caregiver.
Mhm.
So that's what I
Mhm.
feel so strongly about, intervening there and helping the dad to really be more able to accompany her on this journey, because he has a huge impact on the rest of her life,
Yeah.
how he's able to show up for that. So I work with men who have daughters, all ages and stages, and but with a specific focus and specific heart for men who have been widowed. And you can find me primarily on Facebook. You can find it under my name, Claire Weber, and HerDad. And Sarah, do you work with teenage girls, or do you work with over 18? Like, what's the youngest you could work with?
Mostly over 18. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Young adults, and then people as they mature all the way through the all the different stages of and transitions of life.
Okay, good to know, because I often get asked if I work with the daughters of these men.
Yeah.
And I, just because that's extra sensitive to work with, they're still considered children, I guess. But what I would like to say to those girls who may be, 12 to 18-ish, if they might see this video, if somebody shows them this, is that you are so not alone. Whether you've lost a mom, a dad, somebody in between, divorce, there are lots of good resources out there for you. And if for some reason you don't get them, come and find Sarah or I.
Yeah. I was
We'll be waiting for you, and we can help you wherever you are.
Yeah, I always love to chat, have a coffee chat, a Zoom coffee chat, and just connect and offer support in any way that I can. So
Yeah,
the door is open.
for
Yeah.
sure. And where can people find you?
They can find me on my website, sarachizek.com. That's SARACHIZEK.com. Or on Instagram, my handle is the Sara Chizek. And yeah, if you come on over to my website, I have a free video to kind of move through the emotions and lead yourself from grief and rage and turn on, and really alchemize the magic of the pain.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining
Yes.
me here. And thanks for the work you're doing in the world. It's so important and so needed.
Thank you. You too, Claire. Thank you so much. Such a joy to connect and to let these voices echo.
Wonderful. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I will
Mhm.
drop the links for both Sarah and I in the chat, and we would love to hear from you. Have a great day.